However bad the corona crisis gets and however effective or ineffective government responses around the world turn out to be, one thing's for sure: the stronger your economy and the more efficient your government, the better placed you are to cope. Say what you like about China and lax food safety regulations that almost certainly had a hand in the creation and initial spread of this disease, there's little doubt that the draconian response from an authoritarian government has now almost stopped coronavirus in its tracks. Or at least it has, if Chinese figures are to be believed. After more than 80,000 cases and more than 3,000 deaths, yesterday there were reportedly only 8 new cases in Wuhan, the original epicentre of the outbreak. By contrast, in relatively shambolic Italy, there were 2,500 new cases and almost 200 new deaths reported in the past 24 hours alone, bringing the Italian totals to 15,000 infections and well over 1,000 dead. Even in northern Italy, the most prosperous part of the country, the hospital system is reportedly overwhelmed with an acute lack of the intensive care beds needed to treat the most severe cases. You see, this is what happens when a crisis hits a country that's been enfeebled by years of anemic economic growth and hamstrung by chronically weak government. Since 1945, Italy has had 67 governments. 67, that's almost a new government every single year. And that's been exacerbated by economic weakness brought on by membership of the euro, making Italy's exports more expensive and limiting the policy responsibles available to governments. At well over 130% of GDP, Italy's level of public debt makes further borrowing precarious. To put it in perspective, Italy's debt to GDP is more than 6 times that of Australia. Yet even with their debt burden, more debt-funded spending is now unavoidable. And that's because they'll need to spend if the health system is not to collapse and if the economic shutdown is not to produce social disaster. At fully 14% of Italy's economy, tourism is its lifeblood. Yet tourism has almost entirely shut down thanks to the corona crisis and almost certainly won't recover for many months. Naturally, there are some lessons here for Australia. First, debt and deficits and budgets matter. Thank God the coalition was elected when it was back in 2013 and has worked hard to get Labor's deficits under control. I recall even now the lineup of critics when the government wanted to cut waste and wasteful spending, when my former boss implored his ministers to live within their means. But it's only because the budget was back to balance that our government could responsibly afford the $18 billion stimulus package announced by the Prime Minister yesterday. But before we get too cocky or complacent here, it's worth remembering that Labor's baked-in spending has given us net debt at 20% of GDP, and that is yet to be really dealt with. And the revolving door prime ministerships at one stage meant that we'd had as many PMs in the past 5 years as Italy itself. In recent times, when it comes to getting big things done, like building new dams or opening new baseload power stations, as a nation, we haven't exactly covered ourselves in glory. And our China-dependent resources industry, at 8% of total economy, not to mention our over-reliance on foreign university students, doesn't exactly insulate us against external economic shocks either. Yet when compared with other world governments that have done too little too late, or others that have done too much too late, our government appears to be calibrating pretty well its corona crisis response. And setting up an historical National Cabinet Committee of the PM and state and territory leaders, well, that's a smart move and it should be commended. When we get through this, and we will, fixing a lot of the problems like big picture nation building, new dams, power stations, and an end to spending what we can't afford, it all must be looked at as a priority. Because the one thing this corona crisis should have taught all of us is that we must be ready with money in the bank and good government to weather whatever comes next, as it inevitably will, from afar.